I'm Julian Castro, filling in for Alicia Menendez. 8 weeks into the war in Ukraine, and there appears to be no end in sight. Russian forces launched new attacks on Kyiv and other parts of western Ukraine earlier today, a signal that Russia is not backing down after Ukraine took out one of Russia's main warships, dealing the Kremlin a major blow. And in another loss for Russia, the country's state-owned media is reporting that one of its military generals has been killed in combat. But the Ukrainian government says Russia's new attacks on Kyiv are futile.
We have made it clear in the fighting around Kyiv and in Kyiv, they will not be successful. And as we have defeated them around Kyiv, they will be more vindictive and attacking in these ways that you have seen tonight in Kyiv. But again, the big battle right now is happening, continues to happen in the east, where Russians are trying to get at least some victories to present to their people.
Before today, Russia had been refocusing its offensive efforts in eastern Ukraine, where Russia is still expected to step up attacks in the coming days. Ukrainian President Zelensky told The Atlantic that the irony of Russia's plans to intensify violence amid Easter season is not lost on him, saying, quote, "I cannot understand how a Christian country, the Russian Federation, with the largest Orthodox community in the world, will be killing people on these very days. This is not Christian behavior at all, as I understand it. On Easter, they will kill, and they will be killed." NBC News correspondent Ali Arouzi joins me now from Lviv, Ukraine. Ali, thank you for joining us. In addition to new attacks surrounding Kyiv, there was reportedly an air raid launched on the city of Lviv. What can you tell us about what's been happening on the ground? And how are Ukrainians responding to this new wave of attacks?
Good evening, Julian. Well, since the Ukrainians sunk that Moskva battleship, the Russians have stepped up their attacks, not just on civilian locations, but they look like they've been hitting strategic locations. Right after the ship sunk, they hit a missile factory on the outskirts of Kyiv that made Neptune missiles, the ones that sunk the Moskva. And then we heard this morning that there was a raid on Kyiv, but the Ukrainians say that they intercepted 4 cruise missiles that were launched from a Russian Su-35 warplane that took off from Belarus. Now, obviously, they didn't hit their targets, but we can presume that the center of Lviv was not going to be the target for that. It hasn't been so far in this campaign. When they've hit the outskirts of Lviv, they've been strategic locations, oil depots, military training facilities, places that would supply the front lines. So that's probably what they were going for. And again, this morning, they hit a military factory on the outskirts of Kyiv. We don't have a lot of details about what the military factory was, but again, we can assume that that was something that was helping the Ukrainian war effort, and the Russians obviously want to stop that. The sinking of the Moskva, a symbol of Russian military might, was a huge embarrassment to the Russians, and obviously going ahead in this war, they want to prevent the Ukrainians from doing things like that, and they don't want supplies getting to the front line. But in addition to these strategic locations they've also hit civilian targets. They've been shelling Kharkiv very badly for the last 2 days. They hit a residential area in Kharkiv yesterday. They killed about 7 people there, amongst them a 7-month-old baby. Again this morning, they hit Kharkiv, about 2 people dead there. And of course, they've been hitting Mariupol very hard since the beginning of this war.
Ali, thank you so much for your reporting. I'd like to bring in Hagar Chemali. She is a former spokesperson for the UN mission to the United Nations. She was a Syria and Lebanon director at the White House for the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, and she hosts the web series Oh My World with Hagar Chemali. Also with us is John Hudson, national security reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you all both for joining us. John, let me start with you. President Zelensky said this week that the world must be prepared for Putin to use nuclear weapons. With attacks ramping up, what's the calculus that the Russian president will actually go there?
I mean, this is something that the State Department and other U.S. officials have said is certainly a threat that they take very seriously. It's the threat that you have to take most seriously in terms of it involves the annihilation of the entire planet, potentially. So what they have said, they have not noticed a significant change in Russia's nuclear posture. But when it comes to a battle right now that is not going well, that is not going as anticipated for Putin, the fear is that he could do something that would be seen as a game changer, either to intimidate Ukraine or intimidate the West, which has been supplying Ukraine with billions and billions of dollars in military equipment. This would be, the feared sort of nightmare scenario would be sort of dropping a low-yield nuclear weapon somewhere, creating a sort of panic. And, the Russians have sent the United States a diplomatic démarche warning them against increasing arms. And we've seen through public announcements that the United States and Western allies have sent increasingly sophisticated weaponry into Ukraine, things that not just at the outset of the war would take down tanks, these Javelin anti-tank missiles, but also surface-to-air missiles that are sophisticated systems like the S-300 that can actually shoot beyond Ukraine's territory, taking down aircraft into Russian territory and airspace. So all those events have come together to put Putin on his back foot. And as a result, any type of warning, such as the one you mentioned from Zelensky, that the Russians could be prepared to detonate a nuclear weapon, have to be taken extremely seriously. Obviously, Russia does have a history of nuclear saber rattling that could just be a threat that is not going to be backed up. But no one wants to be the one on the losing side of calling Putin's bluff.
Yeah, and you're right about that. I mean, Russia does have quite a history. And Hagar, let me ask you, look, based on the attacks that you saw Russia launch in Syria in past years, what should we expect Russia's ramped up military offensive to look like?
Well, we know the Russian government has zero regard for civilian life. And an example of that is certainly Syria, but also their mercenaries that have been committing human rights atrocities across Africa for years. And those mercenaries from a private military contract group called the Wagner Group, they're in Ukraine right now, just as they've recruited other foreign fighters like Chechens and Syrian fighters, really just the ruthless worst of the worst. And we can see from the general that they've appointed to lead the war, Alexander Dvornikov, who is known as the Butcher of Syria, that they will ramp things up until as far as they can go. And one of the things I've been saying is that they will bulldoze the country if it means that they can seize control of it somehow. And it's the same mentality, by the way, that Syrian President Assad pursued. Syria's President Assad was falling, all but falling, until the Russians came in 2015 with General Dvornikov, the same guy, leading a ruthless campaign there to kill innocent civilians. And so that's what we should expect, is really zero regard for civilian life, more atrocities, more war crimes, and possibly other things like chemical weapons, them pursuing chemical weapons like that wouldn't surprise me, not only because they have no regard for civilian life, but also because they didn't see the United States enforce the infamous red line that President Obama stated back in 2012, when we said, the United States, that should Syria use chemical weapons against its civilians, we would enforce a red line. We never really enforced that. And that's what President Putin remembers. So unfortunately, I would expect an increase in all of these kinds of war crimes and aggression, specifically up until or in the run up to May 9th, which is Victory Day in Russia, when President Putin will look to probably announce some kind of celebration. That's a holiday they celebrate annually, commemorating the Soviet defeat of the Nazis.
And John, I only have about a minute left, but look, European officials drafted plans this week for an embargo on Russian oil products. Something that would have been unthinkable a few months ago, a year ago, but they won't pull that trigger until after the French elections next weekend. Explain why that delay.
Yeah, well, the reality is that high energy prices, there's a big fear in Brussels and other European capitals that high energy prices result in a boost to populist politicians, politicians that have in the past supported Russia, supported Putin, and they've seen that this is just not the time that they want to make this risk. They don't want to, President Macron is facing a very serious challenge from the French far right, Le Pen. There are fears that he could be unseated if something like that happens, if there's a wave of populist support. And we've seen other right-wing populist leaders also do well despite the Kremlin's war right now. Viktor Orban, we also saw political victories elsewhere. So that is a real fear that they're facing. They don't want to pull this trigger right now. They feel like they could face a real penalty at the ballot box. So they're keeping their powder dry on that.
All right. Hagar Chemali and John Hudson, thank you all. Coming up,
Thanks.
The GOP continuing its march towards authoritarianism, with 3 states approving new restrictions on reproductive rights, what Democrats can do to fight back. Plus, fresh details on the Republican plot to overturn the last election, why newly revealed text messages are of special interest to the January 6th Commission. And later, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is halting truck inspections at the border, but is it too little, too late? But first, to Richard Louie, who's standing by with a look at
We are here today to defend those who can't defend themselves. This will represent the most significant protections for life that have been enacted in this state in a generation.
We want Oklahoma to be the most pro-life state in the country. We want to outlaw abortion in the state of Oklahoma.
We're going to respect life here in Kentucky, and that we're going to protect those who cannot speak for themselves. And I think that is an important responsibility of government.
That's today's GOP in action in Florida, Oklahoma, and Kentucky, approving new bans on abortion access. These tactics limiting how families choose to live their lives come in all forms, whether it's restricting reproductive rights or the endless attacks on immigrants and LGBTQ plus youth. This is simply a slow march to authoritarianism, as conservatives hope to cement all of America in their image. And they're doing it by trimming the electorate in their favor, by drawing unfair maps and making it harder to vote in the 2022 midterms. Joining me now, Daniel Strauss, senior political correspondent for The New Republic, Alexandra Marquez, a researcher for NBC News' political unit, and MSNBC political analyst and Democratic strategist, Juanita Tolliver. Welcome. Daniel, I want to start with you. Republicans are rushing to limit reproductive freedom and control the medical care for families with trans kids. How does this square with the party once known for limited government?
I mean, what we're seeing right now is sort of an arms race on the right to be the most conservative governor, to enact the most restrictive laws on abortion, and in some cases, trans rights. There have been a few Republican governors who have vetoed laws limiting young trans people from participating in sports, but for the most part, there's an active debate across the GOP on both issues. In the case of Florida, there shouldn't be a huge amount of surprise. Governor DeSantis is running for re-election. He's the top prospective candidate after Donald Trump in 2024, and he wants to establish his conservative credentials. This is the same as in Texas with Governor Abbott. So we shouldn't be too surprised that he's moving to check this box as being one of the most pro-life governors in the country.
Yeah, it's like you're right. They're in this arms race, and to who can go furthest to the right, and this Republican primary that's already started for 2024. And the most vulnerable are basically the victims of that and held hostage to it. And to speak of that, Alexandra, Republicans are also ramping up attacks on migrants in campaign ads. I want you to take a listen to this.
If Joe Biden keeps shipping illegal immigrants into our states, we're all going to have to learn Spanish. My message to Biden, no way, Jose.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans? The media calls us racist for wanting to build Trump's wall. They censor us, but it doesn't change the truth. Joe Biden's open border is killing Ohioans, with more illegal drugs and more Democrat voters pouring into this country.
Trump just endorsed Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance. Alexandra, talk about these GOP candidates using immigration as a wedge issue to win over Trump's base of voters.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen immigration emerge as an issue in these political ads that we've been seeing, especially since the beginning of March. We've been tracking these ads all across the country, and that's something that really popped up in March as we're going into this slew of primaries in May. And, you know, this is definitely an issue that's always been critical to the GOP base, not just in this election. I think especially with the news from the Biden administration that they are lifting Title 42 and allowing migrants once again to cross the border at the end of May, there's a lot of uncertainty, you know, across the electorate, not just among the GOP base, that is leading Republicans to really try to catalyze on this issue and catalyze voters to vote for them. And I think we're seeing this from moderate Democrats as well, who have come out and been critical of the Biden administration. We've seen that, you know, in Georgia with Senator Raphael Warnock, in Arizona with Senator Mark Kelly, in New Hampshire, Senator Maggie Hassan. So definitely an issue that a lot of voters are wanting to hear from their politicians about, and something that certainly these Republicans going into these primaries can siphon voters, you know, from the center and from the right on this issue.
Now, Juanita, these attacks are so predictable. I mean, we've seen this film so many times before. So I think one important question is, how do Democrats counter the xenophobic campaigning and offer real solutions?
I think it's important that Democrats respond in real time, because part of the midterm calculation that Democrats are making is that all of these harmful, cruel policies are going to mobilize their base. They're going to energize people to turn out and vote in the midterms. And that's partly right. And Republicans are going to get a lot of blame from Democrats about that. But the other thing you're right about, Juliana, is Democrats are going to need to show in real time how they're fighting for the basic rights, the constitutional rights, and the protections that voters deserve. Because what we know is that the same core of voters that will be mobilized is also going to turn to Democrats and say, what are you doing to protect me right now? How are you responding to the needs of migrants who are seeking safer conditions and seeking asylum, which is their legal right? What are Senate Democrats going to do to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which the House already passed, that would codify Roe as law of the land? And so Democrats need to step up and make sure that they have something to show voters that say, we're working on this, Republicans are blocking it, but we're going to keep fighting for you in real time, because blaming Republicans is only going to get Democrats so far in these midterms. Voters are going to want results, and they're going to want results that they can feel in their lives.
Alexandra, could any of these campaign tactics backfire on Republicans as they head into the November general election? These campaign attacks against Democrats, could they backfire?
Certainly. I mean, Republicans are, you know, pitching their tents on these cultural issues, you know, in a really steadfast way. And so I think there are definitely a few things. I mean, on inflation, that's one of the biggest issues right now. And Republicans had been advocating for the Biden administration to release, you know, leases for drilling on federal lands. And you know, on Friday, that's exactly what he did. The Democrats sort of took that back into their camp, you know, claimed that policy decision for themselves. So Republicans can't keep attacking them on that. Abortion is another big cultural issue right now. And with the Supreme Court decision coming out at some point this summer, that's another place where we could definitely see a lot of moderates and other people in the electorate moving towards Democrats in search of, you know, legislative solutions and, you know, protection for reproductive rights on a national level or on state levels, as we've seen, you know, all those abortion bans you mentioned earlier getting passed in states.
Daniel, of course, Florida is the biggest swing state out there. I mean, Trump beat Biden in Florida by just 3 points in 2020. Yet, Governor DeSantis just approved a new congressional map that would give Republicans the clear advantage in more than 70% of the state's congressional districts. How are Republicans like DeSantis growing their power and also diluting the voices of voters of color through these gerrymandered maps?
I mean, look, it's just as you said. These are two districts that he's sort of remapping that where Democrats had an advantage, and it shouldn't be any surprise. I've heard from multiple Democratic strategists in recent years griping about how tough Florida has become. Some have said that it should really be treated as three separate states, just because of how big it is, how diverse it is, and how difficult it is to campaign there for any candidate, Republican or Democratic. And the fact that they have a very active Republican governor looking to boost his party and make inroads with his former members in Congress, as well as Republicans in the state legislature, is a sign of just how interested Republicans are in the state and retaining control and moving Florida away from being a swing state to being a reliably Republican state.
Well, Daniel, Alexandra, Juanita, thank you. Coming up next, newly released texts between Mark Meadows and two Republican members of Congress show more about the GOP plot to overturn the 2020 election, why the January 6th committee is so interested. Plus, another Russian general killed in Ukraine. That's according to Russian state media. What the latest battlefield casualty means for Vladimir Putin and the Russian war effort.
And what was being pursued here, they were trying to get Sidney Powell in, was to overturn what the voters had done. Extraordinary and very dangerous. And the last text that Mr. Roy sent, saying it would be the end of our constitutional republic, that'd be correct.
A member of the January 6th committee condemning newly published texts between Mark Meadows and two GOP congressmen, revealing their support for Trump's coup attempt. In messages first reported by CNN, Senator Mike Lee and Representative Chip Roy cheered on efforts to overturn the election and urged Trump to listen to far-right lawyers like Sidney Powell and John Eastman. Joining me now to discuss, MSNBC legal analyst and former U.S. Attorney Barb McQuade. She's a Michigan University Law School professor and co-host of #SistersInLaw podcast, and Washington Post national investigative correspondent Carol Linick. She's also an MSNBC contributor. Carol, I want to ask you first. Representative Chip Roy of Texas says he has, quote, no apologies for those text messages. What role do these two Republican lawmakers appear to have played in Trump's election conspiracy?
You know, what's so interesting about these texts, some of which have been published before, but we didn't know all the authorship until recently of the most dramatic one, that one about the stake in the heart of the federal republic, that by Representative Chip Roy. What's so interesting about both of these men is they were aiding and abetting everything about challenging the election and the results by Joe Biden until they started to see things that they felt were dangerous to the democracy with a small d, things that they believed would be so unhelpful, not only to the country, but to their party ultimately. If you were going to challenge every election every single time, that was sort of an absolute no-no. And they were very worried about what Donald Trump and some of his friends were up to. And they began to basically pull back, as Representative Chip Roy said to Chief of Staff Mark Meadows when those last plans were being made for how to decertify the results on January 6th. As he said, I'm out. He communicated to Mark Meadows, this is no longer for me. And interestingly, many people didn't notice this at the time, but Roy signaled that he felt this was abhorrent. The day before January 6th, he indicated that the election results couldn't be challenged because so many Republicans who had won in their races for the House would have to say in those swing states that they also had not been appropriately elected if those swing state votes were so dubious. And he saw the hypocrisy. You can't be wrong about not electing Donald Trump, but be right about electing a number of House Republicans.
And Barb, is it time for the January 6th committee to start subpoenaing sitting lawmakers?
Well, that's going to be a tough question because I think they're all acutely aware of the notion that what goes around comes around. And I think the worry is if they subpoena fellow members of Congress, then they're going to see subpoenas to themselves because, turnabout is fair play in the next administration. But I think one thing that makes this incident so different from anything else that Congress investigates is that members of Congress themselves were witnesses and victims of the January 6th attack. There are people in Congress who have firsthand information about these facts. So it's very different from most other matters that Congress considers. And I think for that reason, at some point, it will become necessary to hear from some of these people, like Kevin McCarthy, who was speaking to Donald Trump on that day, Tommy Tuberville, Mike Lee, other people who are in touch with Donald Trump on the day as the insurrection was occurring. And so I think at some point they're just going to have the courage and do the right thing for the American people, even if it means down the road they themselves might be subject to subpoenas.
And Carol, this week, Stephen Miller testified to the January 6th committee for over 8 hours. What do we know about his testimony?
What we know is that it was extremely contentious, as most reporters who've interviewed Stephen Miller will tell you is a normal event. A very contentious hearing in which two things were the focus, or at least two of the key areas where the committee really zeroed in. And one was about the language, the draft language and the ultimate language that Donald Trump used in a speech on the Ellipse on the day of January 6th. The question before the committee and before Stephen Miller is, how'd that language come about? We are going to march on the Capitol. We are going to take our country back. I'm going to go up there with you. How did this we enter the equation? And were there other pieces of coded language in that speech that indicated Donald Trump was potentially illegally inciting that attack on the Capitol, inciting a riot? Miller disputed that we was a problem. He also had some harsh words for the idea that Donald Trump really wanted to march on the Capitol or see violence done. The second piece that we know was a major piece of that conversation with Stephen Miller and the committee was focused on all of the events prior to January 6th, what Donald Trump was up to, what his friends and what Stephen Miller and his other advisors were up to in urging a separate set of electors from the swing states where Biden had fairly won the election, but where Trump wanted to fight that. Stephen Miller was a key enabler of that fight.
Barb, thank you. And Carol, I know you're sticking around with us. Coming up next, infiltrating the Secret Service. How two men posed as federal officers and got away with it for years. What it means for our national security. And later, Governor Greg Abbott backs off his truck inspections at the Texas border. But is it too little too late? How Texans could pay dearly, literally, for this latest political stunt. Two men who faked being federal agents and convinced real members of the Secret Service are now under house arrest awaiting trial. Prosecutors warned the pair, quote, were not merely playing dress up. They say the men had a major weapons stash and spent more than 2 years deceiving Secret Service agents, including one assigned to protect First Lady Jill Biden. Back with me, the Washington Post's Carol Leonnig, and joining me now, MSNBC national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi. He's the former assistant director of counterintelligence for the FBI and also the author of The FBI Way. Carol, why do you think this scheme took so long for the Secret Service to uncover?
You know, heavens to Betsy, we do not know why it took so long, but it's very worrisome that the way it was actually discovered was not by the Secret Service, not by polygraphing employees, not by policies that require reporting that you received, things of great value, free rent up to $40,000 in a luxury apartment in Washington. This was found out because a postal inspector was investigating an alleged attack on a mail carrier in the building where these two imposters were living and where they were also plying Secret Service agents and others with gifts. And when he was investigating this, the inspector found these two men to be super suspicious and sketchy because they identified themselves as belonging to a Department of Homeland Security police force that did not exist. And that was, a huge red flag. And that's how this was all uncovered. It also became public, I should emphasize, also rapidly, much faster than the FBI wanted. And that's because the Secret Service accidentally revealed to one of the suspects in this case that they were under review.
Frank, how shocked are you that federal agents fell for this? And also, how concerned are you about it?
It is mind-boggling. It is just ingrained in you from the academy forward that integrity and ethics are all you've got, and that your success in your mission is based on the public's perception of you as credible. And right now, it appears that the Secret Service and the other agencies that may be caught up in this, there's been mention of DHS employees, there's been some reports of FBI employees at least being in contact with these two defendants. What they should not be doing is downplaying this. I've heard statements from the Secret Service saying, hey, don't worry about this. There's not been an actual compromise of security. We can't see something being turned over in terms of information or national security to these two defendants. But I say that's the wrong approach. The right approach is to say this is so serious that we have to talk about it openly. It has to be a timeout called in the service and any other agency so that it's talked openly about how this is a failure of ethics and integrity. And there needs to be a top to bottom review of internal affairs. How is it handled internally? What's going on that's not working? Where's the training? Is there an outside entity that comes in? So, for example, historically in the FBI, the Office of Professional Responsibility is actually headed by somebody who's not from the FBI. They're traditionally now from DOJ. It's an outside look, somebody objective who's willing to make the hard calls. It's time for that kind of process to be reviewed at Secret Service.
And Carol, speaking of taking all of this seriously, I think one thing that a lot of people are wondering is, what were these two men trying to achieve? And do we have any sense of where their funding came from?
Such good questions to which we do not yet have the answers. And to echo something Frank said, I wrote a story last week which revealed that internally and with their allies, the Secret Service leadership was downplaying this event and saying, hey, we don't see any evidence that any of the crown jewels of important top national security secrets were released to these guys. However, it's a big worry, and agents inside tell me, and former agents tell me, that they 100% agree with what Frank said. Top to bottom review. If you can convince Secret Service agents who are trained to spot spies and scammers to be your friend by saying, I've got a gun for you and some free rent, then that's a big problem. Also, a big problem about downplaying it is the question you just raised. The FBI says they don't know yet what the motive is, and they don't know yet how these people, these two individuals who have a trail of tears of financial bankruptcy and financial problems, how they funded this ruse, this effort for 2 years. It's conceivable they did this alone on some sort of credit, but it's also conceivable that they are the prow of some much larger effort that they don't really understand, and that they're being steered from somebody above. We just don't know yet, and that's why it's dangerous to make conclusions that, we caught it before it got to be a big deal.
Well, we certainly look forward to the follow-through on an investigation. Carol and Frank, thank you. Coming up, I'll introduce you to a man spearheading the effort to bring Ukrainian refugees to safety. How American veterans are making a difference through Project Dynamo. And later, Governor Greg Abbott backing off his latest border stunt. How Texas Republicans' attempt to secure the border through fear tactics appears to have backfired.